We're going to move into a new section today, and this is section 6, which is called Tuning the Response. And this section is all about the grammar that we use in our response. And we're going to begin by looking at using complex sentences, when and how to use these complex sentences to improve communication and range. If we return to the band descriptors, we can see that in order to achieve a band 7 under grammatical range and accuracy, the band descriptors state that the writer uses a variety of complex structures and produces frequent error-free sentences. So therefore, this section will aim to improve both our range, the variety aspect, and the accuracy, the error-free aspect of our grammar, while also maintaining speed and allowing us to answer the question in an appropriate manner. Now, one of the best ways to improve your complexity of grammar is to use dependent clauses with independent clauses, and this creates a complex sentence. That is what a complex sentence is. It's when you combine a dependent clause with an independent clause. But what are these exactly? Now have a look at these sentences. First of all, 200 students studied Chinese. This is one independent clause. The idea is complete. 200 students studied Chinese and 90 students studied French. These are two independent clauses linked by a coordinating conjunction, something like and or but or. So each idea makes sense alone. What about this one? Although 200 students studied Chinese, this is now a dependent clause. The idea is incomplete. It requires the addition of another clause for it to be a complete idea. And so let's have a look at combining that other clause. Although 200 students studied Chinese, 90 studied French. Here we now have the dependent clause, although 200 students studied Chinese, linked to an independent clause, 90 studied French, by using what is called a subordinating conjunction. In this case, although. Now the idea is complete. So when do we use complex sentences? Well, complex sentences, which as mentioned join a dependent clause to an independent clause, are best used when there is an opportunity to compare and contrast two pieces of data. Therefore, these sentences often come in useful in overviews, where we are asked to compare general information. For the same reason, they can also be used when talking about a change in direction for a graph with a trend, or when discussing contrasting figures in comparative graphs. In maps tasks, complex sentences can join two changes to a map, and in processes tasks, they can combine one stage with the next stage. Let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. Here we have a graph with a trend, one that we've seen before. So let's look at a three-step process to creating a complex sentence. As mentioned, first of all, we'll try to look for a contrast in the data, a place where we can compare and create a contrast. For example, 3 categories change a lot and 1 is relatively consistent. So running, basketball and swimming are all quite volatile, they change throughout the period, whereas football remains consistent. So then we'll choose an appropriate subordinating conjunction to start the sentence, for example, whereas, or despite, or while, or although. And then we'll write about one piece of data, followed by a comma, and then we'll write about the other piece of data. So let's have a look at this in example with an overview. Overall, while, there's a subordinating conjunction, running, basketball and swimming all experienced major changes in popularity over the decade. So that's our dependent clause. Then you come to the independent clause after the comma. Interest in football remained relatively consistent. Another example, furthermore, despite interest in running increasing dramatically over the period, Football stayed the most popular sport of choice from start to finish. Notice that despite is a little bit trickier to use, as it needs to be followed by a noun, such as a gerund, rather than a typical subject. Here are a couple of examples of how we could use complex sentences in the detail paragraphs. In terms of ball sports, so focusing here on the football and basketball. Although basketball figures were high between 2001 and 2006, climbing from 55 to 61 students, popularity then plummeted to just 20 students in 2008 and the rest of the decade. So notice here that we're actually including figures as well. As for running and swimming, whereas the former's popularity increased throughout the period, tripling to above 60 students, interest in the latter slipped to 25 after an initial surge from 20 to 50. Now here are just a few tips. Try not to overcomplicate things. It is possible to write incredibly complex yet accurate sentences, but be realistic. The longer the sentence, the more likely you are to make a mistake and confuse the reader. For the same reason, don't use too many complex sentences. Band 7 requires that we have frequent error-free sentences. The more simple sentences we have, the more chance we have of achieving this requirement. And finally, remember that the subordinating conjunction can come at the beginning of the second clause instead of the beginning of the first. But just remember that in this order, we do not add a comma after the conjunction.